All right, hello everybody. Today is a relatively short lecture. Of course, right as I record, Franklin wants out. It's very hot out. We put a washcloth on him, so he can cool off. He doesn't like to wash off very much, but it does cool him off. So let's get today. Like I said, relatively short lecture today. Or I just want to get um, a an interesting sort of concept about the urban development of California and how it grew up and how that has to do with uh, a series of natural disasters, which is something we can relate to in California. Not a new thing happening in California, considering uh, this fall the whole state was on fire, and even those of us that didn't have to live near in danger of the fires, we're definitely breathing the smoke. We have a long history of the relationship between nature and humanity sort of in California changing the way history works. And this is kind of a new way to look at history in a way. It seems like that would be obvious, but there's not until the 1960s and 70s did this field of environmental history take off, which is the study of human interaction with the natural world over time. There's all kinds of different ways to study history. There's different kinds of historians. Most historians, including myself these days, are social historians. We're just looking at basically society and how societies change over time, and that's the study of history. But there's a number of other ways to look at it. Franklin's back without the towel. There's a number of other ways to look at it. There's military historians that are obviously looking at war. You can do looking at politics. Marxist historians look at the class warfare throughout time. But the idea of studying the natural world, the actual planet we live on, and the things around us, it's kind of a new way of looking at things. People just didn't typically do that. For most of human history, people have just considered the earth to be permanent and the land we live on to be this sort of permanent thing, and it's humanity that changes around that. But as we're learning right now, that's not really the case. We're in a time of climate change. When I first heard about environmental history, I'm like, this sounds boring as hell. Like, we study the history of trees, but a tree's got to say about anything. That's not interesting. I'm environmentally conscious. I drive a Prius and things like that, but I don't know. Environmental history just sounded really boring. But the more I learned about it, the more I really liked this idea. And the example I use may seem somewhat obscure for those that don't know anything about ancient history, but I think the core concept can still get across. The Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, collapsed around the 6th century. And when it collapsed, people didn't know oh no, our empire collapsed. So, there was not a set time that one day here's empire, the next day there's not. But we're able to look back and say oh, this empire as it was no longer exists as it once did. Historians kind of decided that as a thing. And since they started doing that, they've all had theories about why the empire collapsed when it did. There's 200 different reasons historians point to. There's poor leadership. The emperors have basically become figureheads. There've been all kinds of political machinations. They had really bad. They changed their immigration policy to be more restrictive, and that ended up coming back against them really badly. They had overly relied on slavery. There's all kinds of different things that is said to have caused this empire to collapse. And any person writing about this would have their own theory. But not until the 1970s did people start to ask, well, what was going on in Europe, like the physical ground and, you know, in trees and oceans, you know, of Europe at this time. And could that have played a role? And one of the reasons that we couldn't necessarily do this before is because we didn't have the science to be able to do this. You know, the science now, you can go back and look at tree rings, and, you know, you could study what we could figure out basically what the weather was like 1,500 years ago. And they were able to see that there was a huge drought. There was this period of warming that was actually partially man-made. They'd chopped down tons of trees in the area. There's mining operations that had a lot of pollution to the air, and it's thought that might have had some factor, or it could have been something natural that happened on its own. But over like about a 50-year period, it was extremely hot. And that causes droughts, that causes crops to fail, that causes starvation, that causes social unrest. And there's talk about social unrest and droughts and things like that, you know, written records of that time, but you know, it's kind of spotted here and there. You can't like connect all of it together until we're able to say like, oh, there is this huge warming period that this, along with the 200 other reasons, is one of the factors that helped cause the collapse of the empire. You know, it's not one like silver bullet thing, but I bring this up as an example, not because it's important to our class or really going to change your life in any sort of way. You know, it's not some amazing revelation, but it's basically, you know, we spent centuries upon centuries, you know, talking about this thing, and nobody just thought to ask, like, well, what was going on the planet at this moment? Could that, you know, have played a role? And I think these days we are in, you know, in this period of climate change. We don't know exactly what's going to happen, but it is going to be massively disruptive in our lifetime. You know, environmental history will tell us a lot about how other people have dealt with other problems and things like that. So that's what environmental history is. And like I said at the beginning, this is important to California history because we also have many disasters. Water is always a short resource in California. And that's going to be a major issue. And we'll talk about that later on as the state grows. You know, there's not enough water for everybody in cities like LA and San Francisco, and that's going to be a big issue. So that's, you know, one thing. But today we're staying in the 1850s and 60s here and looking at stuff going on during the gold rush and seeing how these disasters, fires being a huge issue, earthquakes, of course, being a thing, mudslides being a really big issue that I don't think we worry about as much anymore because we can do more to guard against them, but it's still a big issue. Same thing with flooding, also being extremely important in how California is affected. Most of these, these three things, fire, mudslides, and floods are, we'll see, is largely man-made. This wouldn't be they wouldn't be happening if not for people living in these areas. Earthquakes, not really the case. It's not like they were digging so far under the ground that they caused earthquakes. That's not what happened. We just live in an earthquake-prone area then as we do now. But this is going to change the development of California, importantly, but not necessarily in the way that you think. I wrote a paper on this when I was a student at CSUEV, and I really thought this was interesting when I found out this concept. So in most places around the world, any settlement throughout time, if a disaster happens, a fire, a mudslide or earthquake, a flood or whatever, people will leave that area. Like, well, I don't want to live in an area that is prone to the earth shaking or prone to rivers overflowing and having my home wash away. When an entire city is destroyed, yeah, some people will stay, but that tends to drive away people from there. It hurts the long-term population of that city. In California, it's going to have the opposite effect in a way, because as cities and towns and camps are destroyed, they're going to rebuild them better than ever. And over time, California is going to become more permanent, more urban, have stronger infrastructure, have more developed and state-of-the-art infrastructure because of these successive pieces of destruction happening. The reason for that is gold. The gold is here. You can't take a gold operation somewhere else. Most other sort of places that are centered around some sort of like one major industry, that industry can be done somewhere else by and large. But the gold is here, so people are going to stay here. So gold becomes the means to, or it becomes the reason to keep rebuilding. And it also gives the means, the money. Like I've said, California is just flowing with money at this time. So, and even, in San Francisco, where, there's not actually gold there, San Francisco is the point where, all traffic comes in and out of California at this time, so it needs to be, it needs to be a good major city that can handle all that traffic and handle a large population and things like that. So San Francisco burns down, like, seriously, like 8 times, like in the 19th century. We always, in the 1906 earthquake, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, but then in the 1906 earthquake, that's the very famous one. The earthquake was devastating, and this huge fire destroyed like half of the city. But there had been massive fires and upheaval, in San Francisco many times before. Especially when it was first building up, the entire city was basically canvas and wood. Like I've said, there was a lot of tents and stuff like that. People were flowing into San Francisco at this rapid rate, starting in 1849, and there wasn't time to build up buildings and things like that right away. It was happening, but people still had to live here in the meantime. So mainly it was a tent city, and well, that's prone for fire. We've talked about the Sydney Ducks starting fires and things like that, and that devastating huge parts of the city and terrorizing people. So all of that gets cleared away, and now once a fire happens, they're going to rebuild because the gold, they want to stay here. They have a little bit more money to do it, so they're going to build stronger, right? Rather than building, canvas tents, they're going to build wood structures. Well, that's going to get burned down or knocked down also. So they're going to build with brick structures. Well, that's going to get knocked down also. So then they're going to start building, with more secure concrete structures and things like that. It'll happen sort of in patches. One little part of the city gets destroyed, then it gets built up and developed. Then other parts of the city gets destroyed, and that gets developed. And eventually you have an entire city which is way more permanent and stronger than it would have been if it had not had all of this successive disasters. And on top of that, they're going to, each time they're going to have a chance to sort of make things a little bit better. So sewage systems, you can imagine in a tent city, there's really poor sewage systems, or non-existent as it is. But as they, next time they build up, they're going to build better gutters and pipes and stuff underground and things like that. When that gets destroyed, they're going to build it better and better. And, like I said, all the money is here to be able to do that. Plus, there's tons of smart scientists and engineers here that are like people that had come here to figure out the best way to get gold out of the ground. Well, it turns out they also are pretty good at building sort of infrastructure and things like that. There are fire hydrants will be another huge thing. That's just, the city that keeps burning down, they're going to want to be able to have fire hydrants. Like right after the fire hydrants sort of like became invented as a concept, San Francisco has like will have like the most state-of-the-art system in having that. Even things for how the city is laid out on a grid system. At first, they're sort of built on these, windy trails around the hills and things like that. But if you're going to build a whole new chunk of a city, well, let's put it on this nice, even grid system so it's easy to find your way around and things like that. Have nice numbered streets. All of that develops much quicker than it did anywhere else in the country, and possibly anywhere else in the world. And, it's not just San Francisco. It's happening throughout California, like every little town. If it's not earthquakes or fires, up in gold country, they have problems with mudslides. It's a huge thing. A big part of the mountain just comes sliding down and bringing the town with it. In places like Placerville, well, they're going to build more permanent the next time because of the gold. And because of this, by 1885, 50% of people that lived in California lived in urban areas, which is much higher than the national average. At that same time, only 35% of the people around the country lived in an urban area. But California, which had been 30 years before that, or 40 years before that, was just a backwater. The biggest town was San Francisco that had, a few hundred people in it. And now there are hundreds of thousands of people living in cities in California. And it's kind of a crazy idea. So, not only does California become the most diverse country, or the most diverse state, in the country, and one of the richest in the country, it also becomes the most sort of densely populated and urban of any other country, or any other state in the country. So I always found this to be, again, sort of an interesting concept, that it is disasters that caused urban development. And it happens in the way it grows up in these cities, in these large amounts of town, these densely populated areas. San Francisco is going to be the biggest for a long time. We're just concentrating on that for now. We're going to move to LA when they start developing later on. LA is much, much slower. For all intents and purposes, Los Angeles right now is, 20 dudes, hanging on an orange field, and half of those dudes are cows. So yeah, don't worry about them right now. But like in Northern California is developing super quickly, and it happens along this sort of triangle shape, or maybe you could say fan shape, that with San Francisco at the point of that fan, and then going out along the watershed of all this system of rivers. It goes up because all of these mining camps are built around these rivers, and they're spread out wherever the gold may be there. But the only way to sort of get that gold or bring things down, towards San Francisco is to go on these rivers. They got really good at navigating these rivers, boats and ferries and things like that going down there. And then you have a sort of midpoint cities, these little hubs along the way, like Stockton, Sacramento, Marysville, that, everything in this area fans down to here, everything in this area fans down to here, and then that stuff further fans down to the bay. So you have this large city right on the ocean. That's the hub for everything. And midpoint hubs halfway down the mountainside, and then up into the mountains, all of these smaller little towns. Many of these towns today, we consider to be pretty small, but they were, kind of big at the time. A lot of them, are abandoned, but there's still like, Auburn, is a relatively developed area, things like that. So, and this to this day, is still more or less the shape of our our freeway system along here. It's sort of built around like Highway 80. We still have this sort of development. And of course, many other parts of the state have grown up since then. But right now, places like Sonoma, or down, the south of San Jose, all of that stuff, stuff of the peninsula, it will be kind of farming communities that are help feeding all of this stuff, and they grew up a little bit slower. But anything that's connected to the gold industry is going to grow up really quickly. And is there anything else I wanted to say on that? Yeah, so this is along the watershed. That ends in the bay. I said that, okay. And this watershed is going to be important for a few reasons, not just because it takes all the traffic of people going up and down the mountainside, but with the actual way that mining is going to be done. And I've referenced this before, that it's called hydraulic mining, but they use these super high pressured hoses to basically blow off a huge part of the topsoil, the blow, the huge part of the ground, so they can get the gold that's underneath. Very quickly, gold was discovered in, at a river, and that's where you get, the first set of gold miners going up there with pans, trying to find, flakes of gold in the river. But that was a really short time. What we think of as the gold rush, and like, of people pulling these nuggets out of the ground, and some old prospector biting it and doing a little jig. Is it gold? Gold. That was a pretty brief area. They get all that gold, then they start, digging into the ground and get that easy to stuff. That stuff that's easy to get out, that comes out pretty quickly too. By the end of the 1850s, most of the gold that's easy to get is gone. A decade into the gold rush, and so they're looking for new ways to be able to get the gold out. And hydraulic mining is essentially that. Those places that are like, it's at a steep angle, so it's hard to, you can't dig directly in, this halfway to a mountainside like that. So let's just shoot it with a hose, blow everything off, and then it's a little bit easier to get into. And there had been hydraulic mining going all the way back to the Romans. Had some version of this in the past, but it became much more modern and scientific. In 1853, when a guy named Edward Marston and Anthony Chabot in Nevada City came up with this new way to, the idea is essentially, it's pretty simple. You have a lake, or some body of water that's higher up the mountain, and you stick a hose in it deep down, and the pressure or gravity, once you open that hose, the pressure will push it out really fast. I'm sure there's more to it than that, but I don't know. I don't understand the science of that particularly, but it was very effective. Anthony Chabot is probably a name you've heard before, especially if you live in the East Bay, or particularly in the Hayward area, because there's all, Chabot College. I'm sure some of you went there. There's the Chabot Space Center in Oakland, Chabot Lake. There's all kinds of things named after him, because he comes fabulously wealthy from this. And then he helps design all of these water and sewage systems around the East Bay. Basically, East Bay mud and all of these sort of, the way we get our water in the East Bay was first developed by Chabot. And he's a pretty good guy, actually, also. He donates a lot of that money to women's shelters, like places for women to be able to escape abusive husbands and things like that. Even daycare centers, realizing, like for parents to work, they need to have somewhere to put their children, things like that. And now it's a very progressive idea at this time to have things like that. He builds like old homes for veterans and things. So yeah, he's a pretty great philanthropist, which is why we have so many things named after him today. The problem with hydraulic mining, though, is huge. It sounds like a good idea. Like, all right, it's easier to get that gold if we blow off the topsoil with water. But the thing is, that soil needs to go somewhere. It doesn't just disappear. It's going to go with the water. That's what soil does. And go with the water, and and what water does is try to find, it goes the lowest point possible. It follows gravity, down, and it's going to enter into those rivers, these natural rivers that have been going down the Sierra Nevada watershed for millions of years. And now it's going to have tons and tons of soil in it. It's going to have dirt. And that dirt, like I said, doesn't go away. It's gonna stop. It's gonna in some places, when if a river bends, it'll build up at a certain place along that river, and pretty soon the shape of the river changes. It's gonna make the river bed rise higher, and it's gonna cause massive amounts of flooding. The rivers, if it's constantly changing and raising higher, well, people live in those areas, and floods are going to wash things away. mudslides are another thing this is going to affecting the ground, and and how how the mountain supports here. If you erode underneath here, then part of the mountain's going to go like that. And if you're living up here in Placerville, well, you're sliding down there with it. So all of this dirt is going to wash down, and the people that live in those areas are going to be screwed. And people knew this was happening at the time. It wasn't exactly like some sort of like secret. This is a drawing showing this, what hydraulic mining is doing. And you got these fat cats sitting up here. Like I said, this is at this point, it's corporations, these big industrialist businessmen that own all of the gold mining operations and have all this stuff going, and they're getting hugely rich off of that gold coming off the ground, and the poor people down at the bottom are getting flooded out of their homes. And there wasn't anything, there wasn't law, there's no environmental protection laws at this time. There's no laws against doing that. Like 19th century way of thinking of like, well, that's capitalism. That's, if we're making money up here, well, maybe you just shouldn't live by that river. There's nothing restricting people from doing stuff like that. So it's going to engender a lot of anger, at the rich people in this sense. It's also, of course, going to have huge environmental effects. Just the areas of hydraulic mining that where it's actually, where the hoses actually hit and blow off that topsoil, that doesn't grow back. You have these huge sort of like scars across the mountains here in the Sierra Nevadas, where nothing grows. Still, 150 years later, there's nothing growing there because all that topsoil was blown away. There's nothing else to get there. So these rivets that just torn out of the mountain. So that's one long-term effect. I think a worse one, more detrimentally, is as all of this dirt comes down these rivers, not all of it's going to stop in these rivers. A lot of it is going to make it all the way to the bay. All these rivers meet up into, they go into the Carquinez Strait here and out into the San Francisco Bay. And all of that dirt over the span of about a decade or two is just going to essentially just pave over the bay. It's just like everything that that lives on the floor, the ocean floor, like of the San Francisco Bay, is just going to get smothered with all of this dirt coming in constant succession and waves. All the plant life, animal life will be choked out. And of course, it'll make it extremely unlivable. Even if stuff's not living on the floor, fishes, it's going to just become incredibly polluted. And one of the sort of interesting side effects of this, or just sort of an example of how this impacts, is the death of the oyster industry in California. So oysters were a huge deal. We think of the oysters today as being a bit of sort of fancy food, maybe, I guess, but like at the time it was very much the working man's sort of superfood, especially if you're a miner. It might be difficult to get like fresh produce and things like that, but the oyster has lots of nutrients and minerals and stuff that the body needs. So one oyster can give you a lot of what the body needs, then eat a whole bunch of the other things. And California oysters are being sent as far away as like Colorado, up into the Rockies, to miners up there, so they could eat these oysters and get the benefits of that. And obviously the Ohlone had lived for centuries on the oysters and shellfish of the San Francisco Bay. Well, as Americans and Mexicans and all the other people that had been coming here, they also liked oysters too, and started living off that. And weren't over farming it yet. There was plenty of oysters to be had for everybody. They had oyster farms. along the water that, that people would graze. Jack London was kind of famously an oyster pirate. One of his early careers was basically he had a little boat that he'd go around at night and steal oysters from oyster farms. But everybody, loved these oysters. I don't get it. I think oysters are disgusting. Generally, most seafood I could do without. I think everything that comes to the ocean has a particular flavor. Plus, I think I've said before, it's an alien world down there, and I don't want to eat any of that stuff. But oysters especially are just sea boogers. The texture about it grosses me out. But anyway, all the runoff from the hydraulic mining, all of that soil is just going to completely pave over all of the oysters, the oyster population there, and they will die off in just a few short years, just totally devastating on the California's oyster industry. They even tried to kickstart it again by bringing oysters from back east. Maryland has a lot of oysters. So after the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, they had these aquarium cars that were full of seawater and had a bunch of oysters into it. They went all the way across the country to try and restart the San Francisco Bay oyster industry. I do not know why they just didn't get oysters from like Hog Island and other stuff along the coast. I don't know, maybe it took them a while to discover there were oysters in other places besides the bay. I'm not sure why that is, but I know that it was a thing they did. But it never really got started. Those oysters were smaller already, and they never fully developed. We do have an oyster industry today, but it is places like in Western Sonoma and Marin County and stuff like that. Not a lot of oysters coming out of the bay. I know they do. I have a friend that gets oysters out of the bay, and that's doubly gross, in my opinion. But so it devastates the oyster industry, and it wasn't able to pick up really either, because the bay becomes more and more polluted as all of that plant and animal life helps clean. It's a part of the ecosystem that cleans the water there, and as the Bay Area develops more and more, sewage and industrial waste and runoff are all going to be going into the bay, and the bay can't clean it out in any sort of way. So one of the things that will be affected will be oysters, as they're trying to get it started. And weird little fun fact about oysters is they aren't adversely affected by human waste. So if there is a sewage, there's a sewage pipe that that is shooting everything that comes out of a toilet, everything that's flushed down a toilet, that out into the bay. Oysters thrive in shit water, essentially. Like they don't just survive in it. Like they grow like bigger and stronger. And people for a while were thinking, oh, this is awesome. Like our oysters are getting bigger and stronger. But if a human being eats those oysters, it is incredibly poisonous. It's good for the oyster, bad for the human. There's all that waste and toxicity is still in there. So just as the oyster industry was starting to sort of bounce back, a bunch of people got sick and died. And that was pretty much the nail in the coffin for the Bay Area oyster industry. So I don't know, that's kind of a side note to all this other stuff. One of the places that's going to be most adversely affected is Sacramento. I'm going to have to speed things up here. I got to take my dog to the groomer soon. But I want to get this stuff posted before 2 o'clock per your requests. So the oyster industry, right, I'm in Sacramento now. Sacramento was right in the middle. The part of the reason that San Francisco built up that is that Sutter chose this spot is because it was right in between two rivers. He named them the American River and the Sacramento River. And it was right outside Sutter's Fort. Last we left John Sutter, he was excited about gold being discovered at his mill nearby. and the entire fort was ran out to go look for gold. And from that wealth, he decides he's going to build his own city right outside of his fort. And like I think I'd mentioned before, it was the city was already kind of starting to grow up outside of the fort as it was. But he takes a hand to essentially, like, he wants to run the show. And San Francisco will be, Sacramento will be a company town. It's going to be run like a corporation. It's not going to have a city government for a while. It's going to be run as Sutter's and his company sort of personal, like, shipping, and gambling industry. Sutter actually ends up getting pushed out of this. His son takes over. We'll pretty soon I'll talk more about the fate of John Sutter. He gets pushed out, but it's still his company. Once his investors and his son take over, start building up Sacramento. Is nicely placed in between these two rivers, so all that traffic going through the up and down for the gold rush, all that gold that's leaving down there, all of it's flowing through Sacramento, and those investors are getting very rich off of that idea. But it also, if it's well placed for these two rivers, it's well placed for floods. As hydraulic mining goes on, those floods, those rivers are going to get higher and higher and higher, and pretty soon it becomes a regular thing for Sacramento to flood, which was prone to do even before hydraulic mining. And floods are, we think of floods as the water being the worst part. And it will cause damage to your house, but it will eventually recede. The real danger from floods, especially at this time, was the disease. After all that water comes in, it just sits there, for weeks, maybe even months before it recedes. And standing water like that is for both vector-borne and waterborne viruses. So you have like waterborne diseases like typhoid fever, cholera, and essentially from being dirty water, hepatitis A, but also vector-borne diseases that come from bugs that live around standing water. So malaria, dengue fever, yellow fever, West Nile fever, all of those. Every year, every spring, the snow up in the Sierra Nevada melts. That makes the water rise higher. It comes through right as Sacramento's starting to warm up, and disease devastates the town. In 1850, an estimated 800 people died from cholera in only 20 days. And at the time, that was like more than half the town. And people, were not as dumb as we think they were about diseases. They understood standing water causes diseases if they didn't necessarily understand germ theory and stuff like that. But that didn't mean they could necessarily do anything about it in treating these diseases. So to sort of mitigate the damage, they need to build levees. So next year, the floodwaters won't rise as high. But the Sacramento and American rivers, those water beds are rising higher and higher. So every year they keep getting higher levees. The floods, the rivers keep getting higher and higher, and they can never get ahead of it. And it's a thing since Sacramento is run by a sort of joint stock company like this. They don't really care about the people that live there. They're essentially, they see them as employees. Like, we're lucky, those people are lucky to live here and have a job to be employed by us, and let them deal with this water problem. And they're only going to build just as much levee and infrastructure as they need to, as they feel is necessary to protect their interest, which it's never enough. They're run like any corporation that is only concerned about the bottom line. So you have huge class conflicts as this, because especially wood becomes hard to get. Houses and buildings keep being destroyed, so getting good wood to rebuild with is difficult. But of course, the rich people are able to get all the good wood. Poor people have this waterlogged wood. And there were literally like riots and, you know, people killed over this issue of like wood in Sacramento through the 1850s and 60s. The winter of 1861-62 was known as being the worst. It was an incredibly wet year in general, and there was flooding all the way from Portland, Oregon, all the way down to San Diego. But Sacramento, which had, you know, was prone to all of this stuff anyway, you know, because of neglect and where it was situated, got the worst of this. And there's really just kind of interesting pictures of this. If you Google this this event, it looks like that episode of The Simpsons where Homer is a conceptual artist and he purposely floods the city. He puts doormats over all of the gutters and it floods the city. It's kind of beautiful thing. They're all riding around on boats. Well, in real life, that would, you know, there would be massive amounts of disease. Everybody's homes would be destroyed. Not a good thing to happen. But it does seem kind of fun to be like, you know, down a major street, like, you know, with your rowboat. For a day or two, it would be kind of cool. So yeah, in 1862, many houses, even like two-story houses, simply just floated away. But, you know, they would be, you know, they're sitting there and the wood rots as they're in water, and they would just float off. There's massive amounts of wildlife. You know, there's still, you know, ranching, and you know, once the floodwaters recede, there's this huge problem of dead animals just across the entire middle, you know, the San Joaquin Valley, you know, the top, you know, everything around Sacramento was just rotting cows and things like that for weeks and months, which just seems absolutely disgusting. Because the stuff that, like I said, it doesn't like wash away. It just sits there until the floodwaters eventually recede. Gradually, they did address this problem. They realized, well, this is bad for business to have that. And sort of ironically, like the more they started taking these steps, the more people liked them. And it started resembling more of a regular city government. Eventually, you know, you know, they were always able voting. Democracy in early California was a pretty corrupt thing. You know, the rich people sort of choosing who they want, you know, to get elected. But some of that corruption gets mitigated by the fact that politicians want to be popular. So that, you know, they're going to do things that, you know, that people actually like and aren't dying from. So eventually Sacramento does become a regular city with a legitimate city government. Okay, this last part, I don't know how much I really need to say. This is sort of a summary of some points I made earlier. Like each new brick adds to a city's sense of permanence. In these next couple lectures, we're going to see people were always concerned about once the gold is gone, is anybody going to want to live here in California? Like, sure, it's a beautiful place, but it doesn't have this sort of hope of getting rich off of stuff. Like, what's the second act going to be? And obviously, it does happen, but because of the success of disasters and, you know, it becomes more permanent, people themselves become invested and start, you know, tying down roots and having families and stuff like that. Like, so all of this helps ensure the longevity of California in the post-gold rush era. What else do I have on here? Of course, yeah, improved structures bring a chance of expanded commerce. So each time they rebuild, you know, the businesses are able to do better. Plus, it opens up new jobs, stuff like, you know, construction jobs, lumberjacking, masons. You know, like there will be this entire industry in California that is simply rebuilding after all of these disasters. You know, if you work in construction in California this time, like, you always have work. You know, they need people, so it is going to be lucrative work for somebody that can build a house that's going to withstand the next earthquake or fire or flood. So that has an entire industry going to it too, which we're going to see as California remains a popular destination for people to move to. There is always a booming construction and real estate industry to supply houses for those people. Okay, I'm going to skip by that part. I've talked about before about how San Francisco was sort of seen as it's geographically well located for traffic coming sort of in and out of the Pacific. But when you think about it, especially before the bridges, before the Bay Bridge and the Golden Gate Bridge were built, and of course, the Dunbar and San Mateo Bridge, you have to be able to get to Gold Country. It's that you have to take a ferry boat across, or you have to go all the way around down the peninsula and around San Jose. It's kind of difficult to get around. It's also, like I said, it's cold, it's wet and foggy, it's muddy. And ironically, it still doesn't have a lot of groundwater. So it has this constant water shortage problem despite being cold and wet. And don't get me wrong, I love San Francisco weather is some of my favorite weather. It's one of the reasons I love living around here. But I don't know, it's not for everybody to have, so many gray days, especially if you go out in the sunset or something like that. So there was this constant attempt to basically build new versions of San Francisco, like better shipping ports, places that promise that like, oh, we're going to build a new San Francisco from the ground up, and we're going to have all of the docks and shipping and stuff going in and out. And San Francisco will be a thing of the past. Benicia was one of those. The town of Port Costa, right by there, which maybe I'll talk about later on. It's kind of an interesting story. One of those, Oakland, began, it was supposed to be a better version of San Francisco, but none of them ever really took off, which I'm not sure exactly why. I have a slide for a kind of dumb point like that. Miners ended up in San Francisco for months at a time. Whole industries emerged to cater to fresh off the boat Argonauts. Yeah, all right. Civil society and SF grew up quickly as would make miners dedicated. The more and more people that come through, the more industry that comes up to support that. Yeah, bartenders, clerks, dock workers, grocery stores. It's not just miners that are coming in. Everything becomes much more permanent because of this sort of miners still have to eat and drink and do all this other stuff. So there needs to be people to do that. Well, once the mining dries up, those people are still going to be in those jobs and wanting to do those jobs. So like all of the sort of regular society things that California didn't offer in the beginning, because it was just this chaotic Wild West, just eventually all sort of fall into order, just by sort of natural human nature, and to a certain effect of capitalism of if they're the market hates a vacuum. If there's something that needs to be filled, so there's going to be somebody to fill it, in sort of service industry or a product or things like that. And in that way, California eventually develops into being a regular state like anywhere else. Okay, once again, I'm kind of trailing off at the end there, but I don't know how to end these things really. So stay classy, San Diego.